I never thought I'd find love at my age, let alone with someone half my age, and the daughter of my mother's latest matchmaking attempt. But life has a funny way of surprising you, especially when you least expect it. It all started on a crisp autumn morning in Des Moines. I was sipping my coffee on the porch of my ranch house, watching the sun rise over the rolling fields. My phone buzzed with yet another message from my mother. "Esme, darling, I found the perfect man for you. He's a successful businessman, and he's coming to town next week. You simply must meet him." I sighed, running my fingers through my blonde hair. At 52, I was content with my life as a ranch owner. I didn't need a man to complete me. But try telling that to my well-meaning but overbearing mother. Little did I know that fate had other plans for me that day. I headed into town for the environmental protection rally I'd helped organize. As I stood at the podium, addressing the crowd about the importance of preserving our local wildlife, I noticed a striking brunette in the front row. Her green eyes were filled with passion as she nodded along to my words. After my speech, she approached me with a warm smile. "That was inspiring," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Ivy Flores, the new veterinarian in town. I'd love to discuss your ideas further." As we chatted, I felt an instant connection. Ivy was intelligent, passionate, and shared my love for animals and nature. We ended up talking for hours, losing track of time as we discussed everything from sustainable farming practices to our favorite hiking trails. It wasn't until later that evening when my mother called that I realized the irony of the situation. "Esme, I hope you're free tomorrow night. Mr. Flores and his daughter are coming to dinner. He's the gentleman I told you about." My heart skipped a beat as I realized that Ivy, the woman who had captivated me at the rally, was the daughter of my mother's latest matchmaking attempt. The universe certainly had a twisted sense of humor. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. I found myself looking forward to the dinner, not because of Mr. Flores, but because I couldn't wait to see Ivy again. When they arrived, Ivy's eyes lit up with recognition, and I felt a flutter in my chest. Throughout dinner we exchanged subtle glances and shared inside jokes about our earlier meeting. My mother, oblivious to the connection between Ivy and me, kept trying to steer the conversation towards Mr. Flores's business accomplishments. After dessert, I suggested a walk around the ranch. Ivy eagerly agreed, leaving our parents to discuss business. As we strolled under the starlit sky, our hands brushed against each other, sending shivers down my spine. "I can't believe my father is trying to set you up," Ivy chuckled, shaking her head. "If he only knew." "Knew what?" I asked, my heart racing. Ivy turned to face me, her green eyes sparkling in the moonlight. "That I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the rally." In that moment, standing amongst the wildflowers with the soft glow of the ranch house in the distance, I realized that my life was about to change forever. As Ivy leaned in, her lips meeting mine in a gentle kiss, I knew that this was just the beginning of our wild hearts' journey on the prairie. The weeks following that moonlit kiss were a whirlwind of stolen glances and secret smiles. Ivy and I danced around our growing feelings, neither of us quite ready to address the elephant in the room. How could we explain this unexpected connection to our families, let alone to ourselves? It wasn't until a chilly morning in late autumn that fate intervened once again. I was in the barn tending to my prized mare, Whisper, when I noticed something was off. She was lethargic, her usual spirited demeanor replaced by a worrying stillness. Without hesitation, I called the local vet clinic. "Flores Veterinary Services," a familiar voice answered. My heart skipped a beat. "Ivy, it's Esme Nelson. I need someone to come out to the ranch. My mare isn't feeling well." "I'll be right there," she replied, her tone professional but tinged with concern. 30 minutes later, Ivy's truck pulled up to the barn. She hopped out, her brown hair tied back in a messy ponytail, looking effortlessly beautiful even in her work clothes. As she examined Whisper, I couldn't help but admire her gentle touch and the way she spoke soothingly to the horse. "It looks like a mild colic," Ivy explained, straightening up. "We'll need to monitor her closely for the next few hours." As if on cue, the sky darkened, and a crack of thunder rolled across the prairie. Within minutes, rain was pelting the barn roof, and flashes of lightning illuminated the worried faces of Whisper and the other horses. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while," I said, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in my stomach at the thought of being alone with Ivy. We settled on a pile of hay bales, keeping a watchful eye on Whisper. As the storm raged outside, our conversation flowed easily from horses to our childhoods, to our dreams and fears. Ivy told me about growing up with a father who expected her to marry a successful man and settle down, while all she wanted was to work with animals and make a difference in the world. I've never told anyone this, Ivy confessed, her green eyes meeting mine. But I've always felt like I was living a lie, pretending to be interested in men, going on dates set up by my father. It never felt right. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine. I understand, I said softly. I spent years trying to be the daughter my mother wanted me to be. It wasn't until I bought this ranch that I finally felt like I was living for myself. As the storm began to subside, Ivy checked on Whisper again. She's looking much better, she said with a smile, but I should stay a bit longer to make sure. We spent the rest of the afternoon tending to the horses and talking. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I realized I had never felt so comfortable with anyone before. Thank you for coming out today, I said as we stood by Ivy's truck, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. It's my job, she replied with a shy smile, but I'm glad it was you who called. Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in and kissed her. It was soft and sweet, filled with the promise of something more. When we parted, Ivy's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes sparkled with emotion. I should go, she whispered, but made no move to leave. Or you could stay for dinner, I suggested, my heart pounding. I make a mean beef stew. Ivy's smile widened. I'd like that. As we walked back to the house, hand in hand, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would be worth it. Because for the first time in my life, I felt truly alive, my wild heart finally free to love without boundaries. That night, as we sat on my porch watching the stars come out, Ivy rested her head on my shoulder. What are we doing, Esme? She asked softly. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. I don't know, I admitted. But I know I don't want it to stop. As we shared another kiss, tender and full of promise, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones you never see coming, and ours was just beginning. The days that followed were filled with stolen moments and secret rendezvous. Ivy and I found every excuse to be together, whether it was impromptu visits to check on Whisper or chance encounters at the local farmers market. Each time our eyes met, I felt a jolt of electricity that made me feel alive in ways I never had before. But reality has a way of creeping in, even when you're floating on cloud 9. It came in the form of a phone call from my mother on a sunny Wednesday afternoon. Esme darling, her cheerful voice rang through the speaker. I've arranged a lovely dinner for this Saturday. Mr. Flores and his charming daughter will be joining us. It's time we move things along with you and Mr. Flores, don't you think? My stomach dropped. Mom, I don't think. Nonsense, dear. You're not getting any younger, and Mr. Flores is a catch. I won't take no for an answer. Saturday at 7. Wear that lovely blue dress I bought you last Christmas. Before I could protest further, she hung up. I stared at my phone, a mix of dread and guilt washing over me. How could I sit through a dinner designed to set me up with Ivy's father when all I wanted was to be with Ivy? I called Ivy immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. Hey beautiful, her warm voice answered, instantly calming my nerves. Ivy, we have a problem, I said, explaining the situation. There was a long pause before she spoke. My dad just texted me about the dinner. Gosh, Esme, what are we going to do? We agreed to go through with the dinner, hoping to find a way to navigate this complicated situation without hurting our families. The days leading up to Saturday were filled with anxiety and stolen phone calls, both of us trying to come up with a plan that wouldn't end in disaster. Saturday evening arrived all too quickly. I stood in front of my mirror, smoothing down the blue dress my mother insisted I wear. My blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant updo, but my blue eyes betrayed my nervousness. The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath before heading downstairs. My mother was already ushering Mr. Flores and Ivy into the living room. Ivy looked stunning in a simple green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Our gazes locked, and I felt a familiar flutter in my chest. Esme, you look lovely, Mr. Flores said, kissing my hand. I smiled politely, acutely aware of Ivy's presence just a few feet away. Dinner was an exercise in restraint. My mother dominated the conversation, singing Mr. Flores's praises and not so subtly hinting at what a great couple we would make. Ivy and I exchanged glances across the table, our feet occasionally brushing under the tablecloth in silent support. "So, Esme," Mr. Flores said during dessert, "I hear you're quite the horsewoman. Perhaps you could show me around your ranch sometime?" Before I could answer, Ivy chimed in, "Dad, I've actually been helping Esme with one of her horses. I could show you around next time you visit the clinic." I shot Ivy a grateful look, but my relief was short-lived. "Nonsense, sweetheart," Mr. Flores chuckled. "I'm sure Esme would be a much better guide, no offense to your veterinary skills, of course." The tension in the room was palpable. I could see the hurt in Ivy's eyes, and I wanted nothing more than to reach out and comfort her. As the evening drew to a close, my mother suggested we all take a stroll in the garden. Mr. Flores offered me his arm, which I reluctantly took. We walked ahead, with Ivy and my mother following behind. "You have a beautiful home, Esme," Mr. Flores said, his voice low. "I can see why my daughter speaks so highly of you." I stumbled slightly, caught off guard by his words. "Oh, Ivy talks about me?" He chuckled. "All the time. I haven't seen her this excited about a friend in years." The way he hesitated on the word friend made me wonder if he suspected something. Before I could dwell on it, we reached the rose garden, bathed in moonlight. "Why don't you two enjoy the view?" my mother suggested, practically shoving me closer to Mr. Flores. "Ivy and I will check on that lovely jasmine near the house." As they walked away, I caught Ivy's eye. She looked conflicted, her gaze darting between me and her father. Mr. Flores cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to him. "Esme, I hope I'm not being too forward, but I've enjoyed getting to know you these past few weeks. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner, just the two of us, sometime next week?" My heart raced as I struggled to find the right words. But before I could respond, a soft gasp caught our attention. We turned to see Ivy standing a few feet away, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, turning on her heel and rushing towards the house. Without thinking, I started after her, leaving a confused Mr. Flores behind. I caught up to Ivy near the kitchen door, gently grasping her arm. "Ivy, wait," I pleaded. She turned to face me, her cheeks wet with tears. "I can't do this, Esme. I can't watch my father fall for you when I'm the one who—" Before she could finish, I pulled her close and kissed her, pouring all my feelings into that one moment. It was reckless and dangerous, but I couldn't bear to see her in pain any longer. As we parted, breathless, I became aware of two figures standing in the doorway. My mother and Mr. Flores stared at us, their expressions a mix of shock and confusion. "Esme?" My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, I can explain," Ivy started, her voice shaking. But as we stood there, hands intertwined, facing our parents, I realized that no explanation could fully capture what Ivy and I had found in each other. All we could do now was face the consequences of our wild hearts and hope that love would be enough to weather the storm that was surely coming. The silence that followed our impromptu revelation was deafening. My mother's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, confusion, and finally, a deep disappointment that made my heart ache. Mr. Flores, on the other hand, wore an expression of stunned disbelief, his eyes darting between his daughter and me as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. "I think it's time we left," Mr. Flores finally said, his voice strained. He gently took Ivy's arm, guiding her towards the door. Ivy looked back at me, her green eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Dad, please," she started. But he shook his head. "Not now, Ivy. We'll discuss this at home." As the door closed behind them, I was left alone with my mother. The weight of her gaze felt like a physical presence, pressing down on me. "Esme Nelson," she began, her voice quivering. "What in heaven's name do you think you're doing?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation ahead. "Mom, I know this is a shock, but Ivy and we care for each other, deeply." My mother's laugh was brittle. "Care for each other? Esme, she's half your age, she's a woman, have you lost your mind?" The next few hours were a blur of arguments and tears. My mother couldn't understand, or refused to understand, how I could throw away the life she had envisioned for me. By the time she left, red-faced and shaking, I felt emotionally drained. I spent a sleepless night tossing and turning, my thoughts a chaotic mix of worry for Ivy and fear for our future. When dawn finally broke, I made my way to the barn, finding solace in the familiar routine of caring for my horses. As I was mucking out Whisper's stall, I heard the crunch of gravel under tires. My heart leapt when I saw Ivy's truck pull up. She looked as exhausted as I felt, her usually vibrant face pale and drawn. "Ivy," I breathed, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Are you okay? What happened with your father?" She buried her face in my shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. "It was awful, Esme. He wouldn't listen to anything I said. He kept talking about sending me away to clear my head and find a nice young man." I held her tighter, anger bubbling up inside me. "He can't do that. You're an adult, Ivy." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I know, but he's my dad, Esme, and he controls the veterinary practice. If he cuts me off, I could lose everything I've worked for." The weight of our situation settled over us like a heavy blanket. We spent the morning talking, trying to figure out a way forward. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Ivy's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from her father, demanding she come home. "I have to go," she said reluctantly, "but I'm not giving up on us, Esme. We'll figure this out." As I watched her drive away, I felt a mix of love and determination surge through me. We would find a way no matter what. The next few weeks were a delicate balancing act. Ivy and I had to be careful about our meetings, often using the wildlife sanctuary project as an excuse to see each other. We threw ourselves into the work, finding moments of joy in our shared passion for conservation. One evening, as we were finishing up a successful fundraising event for the sanctuary, the energy between us was electric. The triumph of exceeding our funding goal, combined with the thrill of working side by side, left us both giddy with excitement. As the last of the guests left, Ivy turned to me, her eyes shining. "We did it, Esme, can you believe it?" I couldn't help myself. I pulled her close and kissed her, pouring all my love and pride into that moment. She responded with equal fervor, and soon we found ourselves stumbling towards the ranch house, hands roaming and breath quickening. What followed was a passionate encounter that left us both breathless and glowing. As we lay tangled in the sheets, Ivy traced lazy patterns on my skin. "I love you, Esme," she whispered. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "I love you too, Ivy, more than I ever thought possible." But our bubble of happiness was short-lived. The next morning, as we were having coffee on the porch, we overheard two of my ranch hands gossiping. "Did you hear about Miss Esme and that young vet?" one said in a hushed tone. "Apparently they're, you know." "No way," the other replied, shock evident in his voice. "Miss Esme? But she's always been so proper." Ivy and I exchanged worried glances. If the ranch hands knew, how long before the whole town found out? Our fears were confirmed later that week when I went into town for supplies. I noticed the sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly as I approached. At the feed store, old Mrs. Johnson, who had always been friendly, barely met my eyes as she rang up my purchase. That evening, Ivy called me in tears. "My dad found out," she said, her voice cracking. "Someone at the clinic told him they saw us together at the fundraiser. He's threatening to fire me, Esme. What are we going to do?" As I tried to comfort her, my own doubts and fears threatened to overwhelm me. We were facing not just the disapproval of our families, but potentially the judgment of our entire community. Could our love withstand this pressure? Were we strong enough to face the consequences of our choices? But as I listened to Ivy's voice, filled with both fear and determination, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't ready to give up on us. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Our wild hearts had found each other against all odds, and I was determined to fight for our love, no matter the cost. The following days felt like walking on eggshells. Ivy and I tried to keep our relationship under wraps, but in a small town like Des Moines, secrets have a way of spreading like wildfire. Every time I went into town, I could feel the weight of judgmental stares and hushed whispers following me. One crisp morning, as I was checking the fences on the far side of my property, I saw a familiar truck approaching. My heart sank when I recognized it as Mr. Flores's vehicle. He pulled up beside me, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "Esme," he said, his voice cold. "We need to talk." I nodded, bracing myself for the confrontation. "Hello, Mr. Flores, would you like to come up to the house?" He shook his head. "Here is fine. I want to know what exactly you think you're doing with my daughter." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "Mr. Flores, I understand this is difficult for you, but Ivy and I care deeply for each other. We didn't plan for this to happen, but—" "Didn't plan?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You're old enough to be her mother, Esme. This isn't right. You're confusing her, taking advantage of her youth and inexperience." His words stung, but I stood my ground. "With all due respect, sir, Ivy is a grown woman capable of making her own decisions. I'm not taking advantage of anyone. We love each other." Mr. Flores's face reddened. "Love? This isn't love, it's a midlife crisis, and I won't stand by and watch you ruin my daughter's life and reputation. End this now, or I'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of person you are." As he drove away, leaving me in a cloud of dust, I felt a mixture of anger and fear. I knew Mr. Flores had influence in the community, and his threats weren't to be taken lightly. When I told Ivy about the encounter later that day, she broke down in tears. "He's already making good on his threats, Esme," she sobbed. "He's been telling everyone at the clinic that I'm going through a phase, and that you're manipulating me. Some of my colleagues are starting to treat me differently." I held her close, my heart breaking for the pain she was going through. "We'll get through this, Ivy. We just need to stay strong." But our resolve was tested the very next day when I received a call from my mother. Her voice was shaking with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Esme Nelson, how could you do this to me?" she cried. "Mrs. Johnson just called to tell me all about your scandalous behavior with that young woman. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? I can't even show my face at the garden club anymore." I tried to explain, to make her understand, but she wouldn't listen. By the time she hung up, it was clear that I had lost not only her support but also her respect. The following weeks were a blur of whispered conversations, pointed looks, and mounting pressure from all sides. Ivy's father had made good on his threat, spreading rumors about our relationship throughout the town. Some were sympathetic, but many others looked at us with disgust or pity. One afternoon, as Ivy and I were working on plans for the wildlife sanctuary, we received news that shook us to our core. The local development company, which had been eyeing the land for a new shopping complex, had suddenly gained support from several key community members, including Mr. Flores. "This can't be a coincidence," Ivy said, her voice trembling. "My father's using his influence to sabotage our project." I nodded grimly. "He's hoping that if the sanctuary fails, you'll have no reason to stay here, to stay with me." The realization of how far Mr. Flores was willing to go to separate us was a sobering one. We spent hours strategizing, trying to find a way to save the sanctuary and our relationship. As we sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over the prairie, Ivy turned to me with determination in her eyes. "Esme, I think it's time we stop hiding. If we're going to fight this, we need to do it openly and honestly." I felt a mixture of fear and relief at her words. "Are you sure? There's no going back once we do this." She nodded, taking my hand in hers. "I'm sure. I love you, Esme, and I'm not ashamed of that. Let's show this town what real love looks like." The next day we decided to attend the town hall meeting, where the fate of the wildlife sanctuary would be discussed. As we walked into the crowded room, hand in hand, a hush fell over the crowd. I could see Mr. Flores and my mother sitting near the front, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. When it was our turn to speak, we stood together at the podium. I took a deep breath and began. "Many of you have heard rumors about Ivy and me. Today we're here to tell you the truth. Yes, we're in a relationship. Yes, there's an age difference, but what we have is real, and it's beautiful." Ivy squeezed my hand and continued. "We're not here to ask for your approval. We're here because we believe in this wildlife sanctuary and what it can do for our community. Our love for each other and our love for this land are not separate things. They're part of who we are." As we spoke, I could see the expressions in the room shifting. Some people still looked uncomfortable, but others nodded in understanding. By the time we finished presenting our case for the sanctuary, there was a palpable shift in the energy of the room. When the meeting adjourned, several people approached us to offer their support, both for the sanctuary and for our relationship. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was a start. As we left the town hall, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Ivy looked up at me, her green eyes shining. We did it, Esme. Whatever happens now, we faced it together. I pulled her close, not caring who saw us. Together, I agreed, feeling for the first time that maybe, just maybe, our wild hearts had a chance at happiness after all. The days following the town hall meeting were a whirlwind of activity. Ivy and I threw ourselves into the fight for the wildlife sanctuary, determined to prove that our love could be a force for good in the community. We spent long hours making phone calls, organizing petitions, and meeting with local environmental groups to gather support. Despite our best efforts, the opposition remained strong. The development company had deep pockets and wasn't afraid to use them. They plastered the town with glossy posters promising jobs and economic growth, conveniently ignoring the environmental impact of their proposed shopping complex. One evening, as Ivy and I were poring over environmental impact reports in my living room, we heard a commotion outside. We rushed to the window to see a group of protesters gathered at the end of my driveway, holding signs with slogans like, "Protect our children," and "Traditional values matter." Ivy's face fell as she recognized her father among the crowd. "Gosh, Esme, I can't believe he'd stoop this low," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. I pulled her close, feeling a surge of protectiveness. "It's okay, sweetheart. They can't hurt us." But as the days wore on, the pressure began to take its toll. Ivy came home from the clinic one day in tears, telling me that several longtime clients had taken their business elsewhere. My own ranch was feeling the pinch too, with some buyers suddenly finding excuses not to purchase my horses. It was during this low point that we received an unexpected allies. Sarah, the owner of the local diner and a respected figure in the community, called us one afternoon. "Girls," she said, her voice warm and determined, "I've been watching what's been happening, and I can't stay silent anymore. What you two have is real love, and I'll be damned if I let this town tear that apart. Come by the diner tomorrow. I've got an idea." The next day we entered Sarah's diner to find it packed with familiar faces, some friendly, some curious, and some still wary. Sarah stood at the counter, a mischievous glint in her eye. "All right, folks," she announced, clinking a spoon against a coffee mug to get everyone's attention. "We're here to talk about love, community, and doing what's right. Now, who wants to hear Esme and Ivy's story straight from the horse's mouth?" And just like that, we found ourselves sharing our journey with the town. We talked about our initial meeting at the environmental rally, the connection we felt, and the struggles we'd faced. As we spoke, I could see the expressions around us softening, understanding replacing judgment in many eyes. By the time we finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Even old Mr. Johnson, who I'd always known as a bit of a curmudgeon, came up to us with a gruff, "Well, you two remind me of me and my Martha when we were young. Love is love, I suppose." This impromptu gathering at Sarah's diner marked a turning point. Word spread quickly, and soon we had a growing network of supporters. People began to see our fight for the wildlife sanctuary as more than just an environmental issue. It became a symbol of acceptance and progress in our small town. Our newfound allies brought fresh energy to the campaign. We organized nature walks to showcase the beauty of the land we were trying to protect, held community meetings to discuss sustainable development alternatives, and even put together a local art show featuring works inspired by the prairie ecosystem. As our support grew, the opposition began to falter. The development company's glossy promises started to ring hollow in the face of our community-driven approach. Even some of our initial detractors began to come around, realizing that our love and our commitment to the town were genuine. One sunny afternoon, as Ivy and I were setting up for a fundraising event at the proposed sanctuary site, we spotted a familiar figure approaching. It was my mother, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Esme," she said hesitantly, I owe you an apology. I've been watching everything you and Ivy have been doing for this town and, well, I was wrong about a lot of things." Tears welled up in my eyes as I hugged her tightly. "Oh, Mom," I whispered, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. She pulled back, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Now don't get too sappy on me. I still think you could have found a nice man your own age, but Ivy's a good person, and you two clearly love each other. That's what matters." As my mother helped us set up for the event, chatting easily with Ivy about her veterinary work, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We still had a long way to go, but for the first time, I truly believed we could win this fight. The fundraiser was a resounding success, with more people showing up than we'd dared hope for. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the prairie, Ivy found me amidst the crowd. She pulled me close, her green eyes shining with happiness and determination. "We're going to save this place, Esme," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "And we're going to build a life here together." I kissed her softly, not caring who saw us. "Together," I agreed, my heart swelling with love and hope. As we stood there, surrounded by the beauty of the land we were fighting to protect, and the community that was slowly learning to accept us, I knew that our wild hearts had found their true home. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them hand in hand, our love a beacon of hope in the vast prairie sky. The weeks following our successful fundraiser were a roller coaster of emotions. Our campaign to save the wildlife sanctuary had gained significant momentum, but we were far from winning the war. The development company, backed by some powerful local figures, wasn't going down without a fight. One crisp morning, as Ivy and I were having coffee on my porch, we received a call that made our hearts sink. The town council had scheduled an emergency meeting to vote on the sanctuary proposal. We had less than 48 hours to make our final push. "We can do this," Ivy said, her green eyes blazing with determination. "We've come too far to give up now." I nodded, drawing strength from her resolve. "You're right. Let's rally the troops." We spent the next 2 days in a frenzy of activity, reaching out to every supporter we had. Sarah turned her diner into our unofficial headquarters, the smell of coffee and fresh-baked pies mingling with the buzz of excited conversations as people came in to pick up flyers and sign petitions. The morning of the council meeting dawned bright and clear. As Ivy and I walked hand in hand towards the town hall, we were amazed to see a crowd already gathering. Familiar faces smiled and waved, some holding homemade signs in support of the sanctuary. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. I could see the development company's representatives huddled in one corner, their expensive suits a stark contrast to the casual attire of our supporters. Mr. Flores was among them, his face set in a hard line when he caught sight of Ivy and me. As the meeting began, both sides presented their cases. The developers spoke of economic growth and job opportunities, their words slick and rehearsed. When it was our turn, Ivy and I stood together, our fingers intertwined. "This sanctuary isn't just about preserving land," I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. "It's about preserving our community's soul. It's about showing that progress doesn't have to come at the cost of our natural heritage." Ivy picked up where I left off, her passion evident in every word. "We've shown that this project can bring our town together, create sustainable jobs, and protect the environment we all love. This is our chance to be on the right side of history." As we spoke, I could see the council members exchanging glances, some nodding thoughtfully. When the time came for public comments, I held my breath, unsure of what to expect. What followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Person after person stood up to speak in favor of the sanctuary. There was old Mr. Johnson, talking about how he wanted his grandchildren to experience the same prairie he'd grown up with. Sarah from the diner spoke about the boost in business she'd seen from eco-tourists coming to see our unique ecosystem. But the biggest surprise came when my mother stood up. "I've lived in this town my whole life," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "And I've never been prouder of it than I am right now. My daughter and Ivy have shown us what it means to fight for what you believe in, to love unconditionally, and to bring a community together. This sanctuary is their legacy, and it should be ours too." Tears pricked my eyes as I squeezed Ivy's hand. The room erupted in applause, and I could see several council members wiping their eyes. When the votes were finally tallied, the result was clear: the wildlife sanctuary would be protected, and the development project rejected. The celebration that followed was like nothing I'd ever experienced. The entire town seemed to pour into the streets, cheering and hugging. In the midst of it all, Ivy pulled me close and kissed me, right there in front of everyone. The crowd's cheers grew even louder, and I felt my heart might burst with happiness. As the initial excitement died down, Ivy and I found a quiet moment alone. We stood at the edge of what would now forever be protected land, watching the sun set over the prairie. "We did it, Esme," Ivy said softly, leaning her head on my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around her, marveling at how far we'd come. We sure did, sweetheart. And we did it together. Just then, we heard footsteps approaching. We turned to see Mr. Flores walking towards us, his expression unreadable. "Dad?" Ivy said, tensing slightly beside me. Mr. Flores stopped a few feet away, looking uncomfortable. I wanted to congratulate you both," he said hesitantly. "What you've done for this town, it's impressive." Ivy's eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you, Dad, that means a lot." He nodded, then turned to me. "Esme, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you, about your intentions. I can see now how much you care for my daughter, and for this community." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Thank you, Mr. Flores. Your support means the world to us." He gave a small smile, the first I'd seen from him in months. "Well, I suppose I should get used to calling you Esme. After all, it looks like you're going to be part of the family." As he walked away, leaving Ivy and me in stunned silence, I felt the last piece of our world fall into place. We'd not only saved the sanctuary, but had also begun to heal the rifts in our families and community. That night, as Ivy and I lay tangled together under the stars, our bodies still humming from a passionate celebration of our own, I marveled at the journey we'd been on. From that first meeting at the environmental rally to this moment of triumph, our love had been tested, and had emerged stronger than ever. "What are you thinking about?" Ivy murmured, tracing lazy patterns on my skin. I pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am. How against all odds 2 wild hearts found each other and changed everything." She propped herself up on one elbow, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "We're just getting started, Esme. The best is yet to come." As we sealed that promise with a kiss, I knew she was right. Our love story, like the prairie around us, was wild, beautiful, and full of endless possibilities. The months following our victory over the development company were a whirlwind of activity. Ivy and I threw ourselves into bringing our vision for the wildlife sanctuary to life. We spent long days working alongside volunteers, planting native species, creating nature trails, and building observation decks for visitors to enjoy the breathtaking prairie landscape. As summer faded into autumn, I noticed a subtle shift in our relationship. The initial passion and excitement of our forbidden love had mellowed into something deeper, more comfortable. We still had our moments of wild abandon, stealing kisses behind the barn or making love under the stars, but there was also a sense of stability that I'd never experienced before. One crisp October morning, as we sat on my porch drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Ivy turned to me with a serious expression. "Esme," she said, her voice soft but determined, "I've been thinking, what would you say to making this official?" My heart skipped a beat. "Official? You mean?" She nodded, a shy smile playing on her lips. "I want to marry you, Esme Nelson, right here, on this land we fought so hard to protect. What do you say?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I pulled her close, kissing her with all the love and passion I felt. "Yes," I whispered against her lips. 1,000 times yes. We decided to have a small, intimate ceremony at the sanctuary. As word spread about our engagement, we were touched by the outpouring of support from the community. Sarah insisted on catering the reception, and even old Mr. Johnson offered to play his fiddle for our first dance. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of preparations and nervous excitement. My mother threw herself into helping with the arrangements, her initial reservations about our relationship long forgotten. Even Mr. Flores, who had been slowly warming up to the idea of us as a couple, offered to walk Ivy down the aisle. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the prairie grass swaying gently in the autumn breeze. As I stood waiting for Ivy at the makeshift altar we'd set up overlooking the sanctuary, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was right. This was where I belonged. When Ivy appeared, walking arm in arm with her father, my breath caught in my throat. She was radiant in a simple white dress, her brown hair adorned with wildflowers. As our eyes met, I saw all the love and joy I felt reflected back at me. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. As we sealed our union with a kiss, the small gathering of friends and family erupted in cheers and applause. The reception that followed was a joyous celebration of love and community. We danced under the stars, laughed with our friends, and basked in the glow of our newfound happiness. As the night wore on, Ivy and I snuck away for a quiet moment alone. We stood at the edge of the sanctuary, the sounds of the party fading into the background. Ivy wrapped her arms around me from behind, resting her chin on my shoulder. "Happy Mrs. Nelson Flores?" she murmured, her breath warm against my ear. I turned in her arms, meeting her gaze. "Happier than I ever thought possible," I replied, leaning in for a tender kiss. As we made our way back to the party, hand in hand, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd come. From that first chance meeting at the environmental rally to this moment of perfect happiness, our journey had been filled with challenges and triumphs. We'd faced opposition from our families, judgment from our community, and threats to the land we loved. But through it all, our love had only grown stronger. The next few years were a time of growth and change, both for us and for the sanctuary. We worked tirelessly to expand our conservation efforts, partnering with local schools to create educational programs, and collaborating with researchers to study the unique prairie ecosystem. Our family grew too, in ways we hadn't anticipated. One spring morning we received a call from the local animal shelter about a litter of orphaned coyote pups. Without hesitation, we took them in, bottle-feeding them around the clock and eventually releasing them back into the wild. This experience sparked something in both of us, and soon our home became a haven for all manner of rescued wildlife. As I watched Ivy tenderly caring for an injured hawk one evening, I felt a surge of love so strong it almost overwhelmed me. This was the life I had always dreamed of, even when I didn't know it was possible. "What are you smiling about?" Ivy asked, looking up from her patient. I crossed the room and pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of the bird between us. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," I replied. "How grateful I am that two wild hearts found each other on this prairie." Ivy's eyes sparkled as she leaned in for a kiss. "We're just getting started, love," she whispered against my lips. "The best is yet to come." As we stood there, surrounded by the fruits of our labor and the love we'd built together, I knew she was right. Our story, like the prairie itself, was one of resilience, beauty, and endless possibility. Whatever the future might hold, we would face it together, our wild hearts beating as one.